It's June 14, 2022. I'm Todd Dunn, and today I'm aboard Allied Princess 36 Sailboat Sequester. And I want to talk about a topic that most sailors try to forget about every year. That is, how much does it cost to own a sailboat here on the coast of Maine? Now, I'm going to talk about Maine because that's where I am, that's where I pay the bills, so I know what they are. Other places will be a little different because seasons are longer, boats are used in different ways, and charges for keeping your boat someplace can be quite different. But Maine is going to be sort of ballpark figure that you might expect to own a 36-foot sailboat pretty much anywhere. This is brought on because a friend of mine who just bought a new travel trailer, here he is, has been lamenting the cost of using his travel trailer with the high price of gas. So I thought I'd show him just how much it costs to own a sailboat. So I'm going to break this up into a few different cost categories, and I'm also going to give you two examples. Example one is what I'd call the cheap example, the cheap way to own a sailboat here on the coast of Maine. And example two is the more expensive way to own a sailboat. The big difference is, one, how you store your boat in the winter, because we do haul our boats out pretty much every year here. Insurance policies require us not to use the boat in the winter here, just because the weather here is pretty bad in the winter. And as I said, the weather here is pretty bad, so I personally don't really want to go out on a boat when it's 4 degrees and blowing 50 knots. So we tend to haul the boats out and store them someplace during the winter. And there can be a wide range of costs associated with that. Now, another big factor is, where do you keep the boat during the summer season when you're using it? You can keep it on your own mooring, which is the less expensive way of keeping your boat, or you can keep your boat at a marina, like we're keeping Sequester here at the Great Harbor Marina in Southwest Harbor, Maine this year. That's much more expensive than keeping the boat on a mooring. And it's going to account for most of the difference between the two options. So anyway, let's go through the categories and typical expenses for this boat, bearing in mind that every boat is going to have a little bit different expenses. A bigger boat will have more expensive insurance. It will use more bottom paint to paint the bottom. And there'll be other costs that might be considerably more, and a smaller boat will be cheaper. This is the boat I have, so these are the prices I'm going to give you. I'm going to go through costs for things that are common to the inexpensive way to keep a boat and the expensive way to keep a boat. And there are several categories that I want to talk about. First one is administrative costs. If you have a boat, you're going to have to register it someplace. The state is probably going to want some tax money from you. Well, here in Maine, I pay $84 a year to the state in the form of an excise tax, and they give me a little sticker about this big that I put on the boat for that. And that makes the state happy and makes me $85 poorer. I also have to either register the boat with the state or have it federally documented. Now, in some states, you might end up doing both, but here in Maine, if you're federally documented, you don't register your boat. So I pay the federal documentation fee, which is $26 a year. And then finally, the last administrative cost is the big one. That's insurance. Now, you can go uninsured, but if you get into an accident, you might find, particularly around here, if you hit a boat like my boat in the title shot, you might find yourself in a world of hurt financially. So you want to have insurance I pay $1,180 now for what's called agreed value insurance, which is not depreciated if the boat becomes a total loss. I get whatever the agreed value was. So that's the first category. And it doesn't matter how you store your boat or where you keep it in the summer, those prices are going to be the same. The next category is what I'm going to call annual maintenance. Now, what does this consist of? This is things like for a sailboat where you don't use the engine much, that's an annual oil change. That is changing your fuel filters. That's winterizing the boat in the fall, putting non-toxic antifreeze through the various systems. That's paint and varnish on the top sides. I varnish all the wood on deck every year, and I painted the boot stripe this year. Paint's not cheap. And then painting the bottom. Bottom paint, paint rollers, and then there's masking tape. I think I went through 8 rolls of masking tape this year at about $6 a roll. So when I add all those up, that works out to $430 a year. Now some years it might be a little higher than that. Depends on whether or not I can get the bottom paint on sale or something like that. So that's a common cost for both boats. Now what about periodic expenses, things that come up every now and then that you know are going to come up and you're going to have to come up with the money for them. It doesn't make much sense to look at those things on how much did I spend this year, because that doesn't give you a representation of typical average costs. For example, this year I bought a new Dodger. It's being made right now. It's going to cost $2,100. Well, that's replacing a Dodger that lasted for 16 years. So I don't feel too bad about that. But I'm not going to include that $2,100 in my annual periodic costs. I'm going to divide it by 16. Sails. It's a sailboat. You have to replace the sails periodically. If you're a racer, you're going to have to replace them fairly frequently. If you're a serious racer, like some of the people here in the Great Harbor of Mount Desert Island, you might replace them a couple of times a year. Well, I'm not that serious. I work on a 20-year basis for my sails. And there are other things. I had to buy a new chart plotter this year because my old one died. Next year I'm going to buy radar. I've replaced the winches on the boat. I had to put roller furling on the boat some time ago. You know, little things like that. They're fairly big ticket items, but they don't happen very often. And going through the list of the things that I have put on the boat and amortizing them out for how long they last typically, other things like batteries. I replace my batteries about once every 8 years. I figure I spend about $750 per year on average for periodic expenses. And now we come to some things that are going to be a little bit more specific to my cases. Now, we're talking about if I'm keeping the boat on the cheap, keeping it on my own mooring, well, I have to acquire the mooring. I have to buy it. They're not free. And I'm going to have to pay the town that the mooring is located in for a permit every year. I'm going to have the mooring inspected periodically. The town here requires it every 3 years. And if I want my chain to last a long time, when I'm not using the mooring, we drop the chain down into the mud on the bottom, which makes it last about twice as long. And that costs money because we have to drop it in the fall and pull it back up in the spring. And I figure when you add all that up, that I spend about $615 a year for my mooring. On the other hand, if I kept the boat at the marina, like we're doing here, marinas are not cheap in Maine. I pay $145 a foot based on the length of the boat for the season. So that means I pay $5,220 to keep this boat at this marina here in Southwest Harbor, Maine. That's a big difference. $615 to keep my boat on a mooring, $5,220 to keep it here at the marina. Then the last category is storage. We do haul our boats out in the winter. We take the masts down, largely because we have some really nasty windstorms in the winter, and the boat yards don't want a boat to blow over in the yard and maybe knock a couple of other boats over. So it is much less likely to happen if the masts are down. So every fall we pay to have the boat hauled out, to have the mast taken down, and to have the hull pressure washed. And then in the spring we have the mast put back up and we launch the boat. If you average the two out, it works to about $600 in the fall and about $600 in the spring for this boat. And storage for the masts. They take the mast down, they got to put them someplace, I get charged for that. That's about, pressure wash and mast storage comes out to about $200 for this boat. So roughly $1,400 for a haul, unstep, pressure wash, store the masts, and then restep the masts and launch the boat in the spring. And then comes the next big ticket item. Where are we going to store the boat? You have two options around here. You can store it outside if you're going to a boat yard. They're probably going to require that you have the top size shrink wrapped. And where I keep my boat, if I did that, it would come to $1,550 a year approximately. Or you can have the boat put into a cold storage shed. That's an unheated shed, which is what I do, and I pay $1,980 every winter for that. So let's go through and add these categories up. First, we'll look at the low end category, and that is storing your boat outside and keeping it on a mooring in the summer. When you go through that, it adds up to $6,035 a year. Now, if you keep your boat in a boat yard, that's just about as cheap as you're going to be able to keep a 36-foot boat and use it for a typical year. And that covers pretty much everything. Now, what about the expensive category? Inside storage in the winter, which is much nicer in my opinion, and keeping the boat at a marina, where all I have to do is walk down here to go aboard. I don't have to hop in my dinghy and row or motor out to the boat. If I keep the boat on a mooring, as I said, $615. Keeping it here at the marina, though, $5,220. So if I add all that up for the expensive class, all of the things are the same for both, it costs me just under $11,000 a year to keep this 36-foot boat with inside storage in the winter and keep it at the marina in the summer. So that's a fair chunk of money. One way of looking at it is to look at how much does it cost every time you use the boat. And let's say if I was a weekend sailor, I have one of those nasty job things, I might use the boat 30 days a year, 15 weekends, because obviously not all weekends are very nice. And some weekends with driving rain or socked in with fog, I might not want to use the boat. 30 days a year, if I was paying $11,000 a year, that means I'm looking at about $375 every day that I use the boat. That's pretty expensive. Now, if I was keeping the boat on a mooring and outside storing it, my 30 days a year, that is going to be looking at $6,000 total cost, roughly. 30 days a year, that's $200 a day. Quite a bit less. Still not cheap. Now, personally, I use my boat about 100 days a year, so my per use cost, even keeping it outside, is only about $100 a day. So it's a lot more reasonable, but still not really cheap, particularly if I just go out for an afternoon sail and use the boat for 3 hours. But I try not to think about that when I'm using the boat. Matter of fact, this video is kind of depressing to make because it brings home just how much money I'm spending every year to own this 50-year-old sailboat. So, hope you found this interesting and informative. And if you're thinking of buying a sailboat, having an idea of what these numbers look like might be a factor in deciding whether or not to go ahead with the purchase. Well, if you can afford $1,000 a month, yeah, you can keep your boat at a marina. You can store it inside in the winter if you're in Maine, and all that, and be great. If you can't afford that, you might have to keep your boat on a mooring, store it outside, or if you can find somebody to truck it home, maybe even keep it in your yard. I've done that with this boat to save money. And anyway, hope you enjoyed this. If you did, please give me a thumbs up. And if you haven't, why don't you consider subscribing to my channel and maybe even clicking that notification bell. Thanks for watching.